So I'm going to go through an introduction to modernism, which is late 19th century to mid 20th centuries. We're kind of rolling out of realism and into this time period. A lot of things are happening during this time period in history. You have your two world wars, you have the Great Depression, you have the Roaring Twenties, and so a lot of things are changing. So America is entering the 20th century really optimistic, and we're kind of establishing ourselves as a strong world power. But the 20s, while that was really a time of prosperity, we roll right out of the 20s and into the Great Depression. The two world wars happened, they hit, and so a lot of things were happening and things were changing, and so that kind of ushered in this new era of American literature, because people were struggling to make sense of like everything that was happening to them. And so that's where modernism really kind of started. So we start at the beginning. We have the fast paced living of the Harlem Renaissance and the Roaring Twenties, which was also the Jazz Age. A lot of art, art and literature by prominent African American writers, Langston Hughes, during that time. And then that Great Depression we roll into. And so period of time was when authors began to kind of experiment with those different styles of writing, that breaking away from traditional styles of poetry. So modern authors shared a common purpose, despite the fact that their works were kind of all over the spectrum. Um, that was to capture the essence of modern life or modern as they knew it. And that's probably why most modernist literature was written in a kind of with a pessimistic attitude. You had the thoughts and confusion during the Great Depression, the war, people were unstable, um, with, financially stable and isolation and all kinds of things they're trying to piece together and make sense of the world around them. So there's a lot of fragmentation in the thought processes of a lot of these American authors. So also a loss of faith, a loss of hope. And the leaders of the time period and the people that were making the big decisions, and that kind of led to a collapse of morality and a collapse of values, and that leads to a loss of a sense of identity, and so kind of everything was kind of a snowball. um, the literature of the time period is like I said was is often fragmented. It's often um, you know um, away from the traditional forms of writing where everything is very structured. It causes confusion when you read. It causes those emotions, because that's the emotions that they were feeling. So the themes of confusion and disillusionment we're going to see a lot in the literature that we're going to study from the time period. And then we have the major authors that are writing at the time, the loss of hope in the American dream, like Fitzgerald and the Great Gatsby, Hemingway, Faulkner writing really heavily about the Great Depression, T.S. Eliot's very fragmented piece, The Wasteland, which we're going to study in a few weeks, and Ezra Pound. All of these major authors, this time period became known as the Lost Generation. Okay? Modernism, by definition, is a break with the past and a search for new forms of expression. It fosters a period of experimentation in the arts, late 19th, early mid 20th century, in the years following World War One. So we have a lot of changes that are happening socially and politically. Um, Financially, during the time period, as well as some advances in science and social science. I'm talking about Freud and uh, psychology and sociology and things like that. So there was a lot of kind of conflicting ideals kind of happening at the time. And so that's probably why modernists felt kind of alienated from. Um, the beliefs of the past, that whole idea of the Victorian morality where you live well and you're rewarded for your good living, that optimism, those standard conventions of writing that we looked at, more, maybe more in 201 and rolling just a little bit into 202. And so those new ideas in psychology and philosophy and political theory all kind of kindled a new age of expressionism. So after World War One, mankind, or humankind, Americans had lost kind of faith in Western society and culture, and that is going to where we're going to see that sense of disillusionment and that fragmentation in a lot of those writings. Let's look at some characteristics really quick, and I'll talk about each one of those. So, the major characteristics of the modernist literature is experimentation, individualism, multiple perspectives, a lot of free verse. We're going to see that break from the rigors of like poetry of the past, the use of literary devices, and a sense of disillusionment and loss. Okay, so experimentation, you had modernist literature, you had a lot of different experimental writing techniques that broke away from those old forms and techniques and the conventional rules of storytelling. So we're going to have some blended imagery, some absurdism. We're going to see in, especially like in Eliot and in the Wasteland, nonlinear narratives. Nonlinear means that it's not chronological in time, so events can jump around, not like foreshadowing, but just jump around in time, which causes a little bit of confusion. And then stream of consciousness, which is a free flowing inner thoughts, your inner monologue that kind of mimics the pattern of human thought, like what we think. Sometimes when our minds are racing and we are, our minds jump from one thing to another. Individualism, modernist literature typically focuses on the individual rather than society as a whole. Stories are going to follow characters as they adapt to this changing world and how they find their place within this changing world and what that looks like. And so that means that they're often going to deal with those difficult circumstances and challenges and war and poverty and those kinds of things. So the individual is more interesting than society. Those those modernist writers were really fascinated with how individuals adapted to what was happening around them. In some cases, the individual is going to triumph, and in some cases, they're going to tank. They're going to crash. They could die. They could lose everything, like what we see in like the Great Depression literature, that kind of thing. But most midline characters are just people that are barely able to keep their heads above the water. They're dealing with the situations that's happening to them. And so writers are going to present those things to kind of help show how they build character over time. Many modernist writers write in first person perspective with multiple characters to emphasize each of the characters and add depth to the story by those viewpoints as multiple viewpoints. Free verse, many modernist poets reject the traditional structure of poetry, opted for free verse, which it means that there's no consistent rhyme scheme, there's no consistent metrical pattern or musical form, rhythm. There may not be the lines may be disjointed, and you might see a lot of punctuation used in different forms, shape, poems, all those things kind of came out of this time period. Okay, the use of literary devices. Many modernist writers rely on literary devices like symbolism, imagery to help the reader understand the writing and to help them create a stronger connection between the text and what they and them themselves, their schema and what they know. So many modernist writers infused objects, people, places, and events with significant meanings. Okay, some of that's hidden like a code, um, poem as a riddle that had to be figured out, kind of had its beginnings in the modernist period. Symbolism is not a new concept at this time, but the use of symbols, the way the modernists use symbols, was really innovative for the time period, and they leave much more to the reader's imagination than earlier writers that use symbols, leading to kind of open-ended narratives that could be multiple interpretations. I think I've talked about ambiguity before, and how it leaves kind of open for multiple interpretations. Okay, the last one is a sense of disillusionment and loss. And this is, a major kind of um, subsection, I guess, maybe of modernism, modern literature. This could be centered on a specific individual or against society as a whole, American society towards civilization. We may have a lot of destruction. Or we can have the flip side of that where we have a lot of hope that things can get better. So you've got F. Scott Fitzgerald and in The Great Gatsby and like the American Dream and how Gatsby was just obsessed with getting things back to the way that they had been in the past. And then you have Richard Wright kind of exposing American racism in Native Son, Zora Neale Hurston and Their Eyes Were Watching God, which if you've not read Their Eyes Were Watching God, it's definitely one of those texts that you don't need to miss out on. But telling the story of a black woman and her three marriages there in Their Eyes Were Watching God. Ernest Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms, that whole disillusionment of the lost generation. Those are kind of negative, self-destructive, against society or towards civilization. And then you have a lot of hope in like Willa Cather and O Pioneers and My Antonia, John Steinbeck and Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath, and people just struggling to get by and dealing with difficult challenges. And then William Faulkner using those stream of consciousness monologues and other formal techniques and the sound and the fury, um, which on a side note, one I love Oprah's beach picks, her summer reads, and they picked Faulkner for the beach, like the beach reads for one year, and I'm pretty sure maybe I shouldn't say this in this class, but William Faulkner is probably one of the most boring writers that I think I've ever read in my entire life. And why anybody would want to read them at the beach while you're drinking beer or margaritas is just beyond me. Like you probably need a lot of that to get through those texts. I didn't pick any Faulkner for us to read over the course of this semester, so you're welcome. Okay, so keeping all those thoughts in mind, we're going to be moving into our study of some modernist literature. We're going to start this first week with some poems by Frost and Edwin Arlington Robinson, and then we'll move into Carlos Williams and some more modernist pieces moving forward. And so making sure that you're keeping these characteristics in the back of your head as we continue with our study on modernism.